hear myself. There's no echo. That's brilliant. That's
We're,
quite a
we're,
smooth
we're,
start.
we're already winning.
Well, yeah, great start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last Sharing Shakespeare session of this November term. This is the fourth session we've had, and probably the last of the year, but maybe the next year there'll be more. But we've got a great one to finish off with. I'm joined by the amazing Dr. Will Tosh. Everyone clap at home.
Hi, Jamie. Hello, everyone.
Will, so I'm going to introduce you. And so we met first when I was in the cast of Titus Andronicus at the Globe.
It's Titus, yes.
Yeah, so that was our first one.
Directed by Lucy Bailey.
Lucy Bailey, that was 2014.
Summer 2014.
Yeah, the Roman season, that was it.
Oh, wow.
So you're, how would you describe yourself? What's your job?
So I'm an academic and I'm research fellow and lecturer at the Globe. So the Globe is unusual. It's certainly unique in the UK. It may be unique in the world, I say cautiously, in having a salaried academic staff attached to it. So the Globe, since its foundation, has had obviously a very close association with research and academia and scholarship, partly from its from the sort of work and the research project that went into its design and construction, but then arising out of the work that actors did on the stage. So more or less continuously from its opening in '97, there's been a research staff of some sort. I say more or less because there were sort of dark and complex lacunae in the sort of late '90s and early 00s where it all went a bit wrong. But more or less, it's been pretty solid over the 20-odd years of the Globe's operation. The higher ed and research bit of the Globe is led by the amazing Professor Farah Kareen Cooper, and she's been there for good 12 years, he says cautiously, maybe pushing 14 or 15. And has seen she's spanned the 4 artistic directors that we've had. So I work with her. I support Farah in running our higher education program, so our university level courses, and our research program, which is based around the use of our spaces, the Globe and the Sam Wanamaker Playhouse. It's also we also of course research into theatre buildings. That's one of our kind of stock in trades. But I have, and Farah has, and the other scholars we work with also have our own research interests and our own writing interests, which are certainly associated with early modern drama and Shakespeare, but are not necessarily 100% performance focused. So I do quite a lot of work on early modern queerness and male friendships, and I've got a current project looking at the moment at an amazing late 16th century poet called Richard Barnfield, whose life weaves in and out of Shakespeare's in a very interesting way. So that's the research academic side of what I do, and the sort of other half of the job is working as, I suppose you'd call it, a research dramaturg with the theatre department. So working with directors, and then once a show is up and rehearsing with theatre companies on kind of teasing apart the various kind of themes and issues in a play, being a resource for people who want to know more about a particular kind of context or a world that a play throws up, sometimes as simple as unpicking a word or a phrase, and sometimes it's a whole kind of can of amazing, exciting, provocative worms if you're looking at a play like The Merchant of Venice or The Taming of the Shrew or Othello. And the major obvious first question about those plays you might ask is, what did anti-Semitism mean in the 1590s? What was misogyny in the 1590s? What was racism in 1600? And so those are conversations that we can facilitate. Is such a horrible word. I'm so sorry that one.
I like that word.
No, it's terrible. It makes it feel like there's like sort of whiteboards and flip charts, and that's not what we do. But those are conversations that we can host, and we can kind of guide in the rehearsal room if necessary.
Yeah, because very early on, so in both Titus and Comedy of Errors, which eagle-eyed viewers at home
I've
will
got, I've
see.
got a
There's a
poster,
poster.
actual poster. That could be Jamie. Jamie wore
That's,
that costume.
yeah,
So
that's not
not
me
him.
though. That's Brody. Yeah,
Yeah.
but I think quite early on in the rehearsal process, we had a lecture from you,
Yeah.
which was brilliant and did all those things you've just
Yeah.
described of kind of that dramaturgy. A lot of actors though, and a lot of theatre makers are, I'd say, suspicious of academia and maybe possessive of Shakespeare. And I don't know if you'd say it's the same for your camp, but there's what do actors and theatre makers have to learn from academia?
It's very interesting. Globe artistic directors have had a different attitude to that meeting place between academia and actors and scholars and actors. Dominic Drumgoole, who was running the place when you did Titus and comedy, was pretty hard line about it. Actually, he was quite happy to say to a director, "You're getting a lecture, and you've just got to find time in the schedule for it." Which it's very nice to have that support, but more than once I would kind of walk in to not, I mean, no one was ever anything less than polite and professional, but walking into a room to give a lecture for a company that didn't massively want to have it, and it shows companies will kind of range in terms of that initial sense of welcome. I would say, and I hope this comes out the way I want it to come out. I never left a room having done a lecture with the same feeling. So it was really interesting to get to sort of feel the difference between a room full of actors who had been told that a bit like a costume fitting or a singing call, they've just got to sort of a lecture for 30 minutes. And then after 30 or 40 minutes of 25-minute lecture and some questions, it's almost impossible to kind of close it down and to kind of and kind of get feeding those questions to then sort of, or fielding those questions to then follow them up and give kind of feedback later to the stage manager with answers to those questions was always a really exciting part of the job, because it was a kind of clear sense of where actors and the director were going with it. So there is absolutely that divide. There is absolutely that divide between the sort of bookish Shakespeare, the ostensibly kind of what people imagine to be the bookish Shakespeare and the sort of stuff you kind of learn at school, versus the text that as a performer and in your body and in your mind, but more importantly it in yourself and I think those two things are not in opposition, and never have been really. And I think one of the reasons the Globe is one of very small numbers of theatres to have any kind of scholarly operation, if not the only one, is that it's really hard to make that meeting point work. And it helps that I had a performer and a very inglorious career as an actor. And I've worked for a long, even before I worked at the Globe, I've worked with a lot of actors and directors. And I just really enjoy that form of communication, because from my point of view, actors are like the best people to talk to about plays. I'm not saying they're like students, because they're way beyond students, and that they're certainly not anything other than consummate professionals. But the fact is, if you go into a room to talk about a play, you couldn't hope for a group of people who are more committed to talking about that play than a bunch of actors who literally have to recite it from scratch in 4 weeks' time. And they are unbelievably committed to finding out as much as possible to make their performance the best it can be. And even if initially they're not convinced that the best way to do that is by listening to a lecture, nonetheless, that sense of purpose and objective is as keen as in anyone else, which is to make it good. And if you can, in some senses, show that the background, the information, the world that you're sharing with them is helpful and is potentially relevant, any actor worth his or her salt is going to want to pursue that, because it's going to help them.
And so I remember for Comedy Veras, it was a brilliant lecture on Martin Guerre,
Oh yeah.
Which I never would have. I would never would have kind of ventured that way in that direction by myself. But it unlocked so much about my understanding, and any little kind of gobbet of information that kind of gives you kind of a key into unlocking another part of the play. You just
that's really
cling
nice
on
to
to.
hear. And that's so nice to hear. It was about how early modern people thought about twins and doubleness, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Because of course that's comedy of errors. On one level, it's so crazy that these two sets of twins turn up and everything goes wrong, and it's not that it's a documentary, but that it's kind of drawing on sort of like weird fascinations about what twinship is or what it might mean, and also like the Matanguer story, which I'm sure some people watching will have seen the film in the 80s with Gérard Depardieu. Was written about at great length by an astonishing historian called Natalie Zeman Davis some years before the film on which it was based. But it's this extraordinary story of someone who turns up in a French village in the 17th century claiming to be someone who'd gone off to war years before, called Matanguer. And eventually it's discovered that he's not, and it all ends quite badly. But the fact is, he looks nothing like Matanguer. He looks nothing like Matanguer. He's got different sized feet. He's like, everything is different. But the Matanguer's wife is like, yeah, all right. Okay, yeah, it's him. But for various kind of crazy reasons to do with her own situation and her own status. But it says something so interesting about what identicality might mean, or what being mistaken for someone else might mean. And maybe liberates us from getting hung up on, but are you like physically completely identical? And if you're not, then the whole play is blown out of the water. And so that is it's a great example of something that can, as you say, open up a way of thinking about a play and get it productively out of a modern space. Not to say that you don't want it to be in it, but to think about where it might have come from, and then you can take it off in whatever journey you want.
Yeah. And that's a perfect segue. And I said I'd give you a sort of a provocative image, which sounds a lot more exciting than it maybe is. But no, but just before we do, just to remind everyone, if you want to ask questions, if you just write into the YouTube chat, and I'll keep an eye on them and pass them on. But the provocation is this idea of Shakespeare as this lone phenomenal genius. Who just kind of emerged out of nowhere. I think that's an image a lot of people have, that he's kind of hunched over a desk writing these great works of literature. What created Shakespeare? How was he able to write these plays? What is
it's the fact? I really like that as a provocation, because the thing that prompts that question is what I think I spend quite a lot of my time as a teacher and as I guess as a scholar and as someone who speaks to audiences, and I spend quite a lot of my time sort of unpacking that as an assumption, I guess. And that's sort of been the mission of Shakespeare studies and Renaissance literature studies for the past 40 years, I think I would say. It arises out of lots of critical developments and intellectual developments in the 60s and 70s in various kind of mad French theory kind of realms to do with what an author is and what reading is, all that sort of stuff. But it had quite a material impact on the way people researched and thought about Shakespeare, because it pulled people away from thinking about Shakespeare as a literary philosopher and as effectively a secular literary saint into someone who is embedded in a particular professional context of the early modern English theatre. So really, for the past 3 decades or more, you're much more likely to pick up a biography or a book about Shakespeare, which is effectively a man of his time type book. And the most sort of brilliant example of this, the most brilliant recent example of this, and actually I've got it literally on my desk right here, so I was looking at it, is Jim Shapiro's 1599, which came out at the start of this century. Let's see if I can find out precisely when, 2005, which takes a year of Shakespeare's life, 1599, and basically fills in all of the edges, everything that was going on in Shakespeare's life, and shows how, not necessarily always directly, sometimes quite obliquely, the world around Shakespeare made itself known in his plays and poems. So there's been a really strong and persistent and also quite consistent move to studying Shakespeare in a way that places him in a context. And one of the results of that has been that it's opened up the world that Shakespeare lived and worked in to feature a very large number of people who he worked with as a literary collaborator in his mainly in his early and later years. So that's sort of where his literary collaboration lies. He collaborates with Marlowe, with Thomas Nash, with George Peele in the early 1590s. He then collaborates with John Fletcher later on in his career. Collaborates early, presumably to kind of learn his craft, collaborates later on when he just can't be asked. Someone else can do half the work and he just wants to retire to Stratford. And then you've got that kind of middle period where he's less overtly collaborative, but he is still working and writing in a world in which a large proportion of his resources are determined by other people, either by who those people are, the actors he's working for, or by the audience that he's writing for, the theatre that he's in. So it's very difficult now, I think, to think about Shakespeare as the writer in the garret. That sort of that iconic scene from Shakespeare in Love, where Joseph Fiennes is there kind of scrawling, getting his hands covered in ink and scrawling in his room and tossing pages of, I mean, maybe that is how he wrote, but the process you don't see on that screen is then gathering them up, going to kind of spread them out on a table, talk through with Burbage, talk through with X, work out one, and I think that process of participation rather than perhaps collaboration is where we should see his writing emerging from. And that is not by any stretch of the imagination to move the responsibility for those works from Shakespeare, but to say that his genius was in producing those works from that context, not producing them in isolation and just them coming out of his brain. They came out of his brain that had been stimulated and sort of fed by his interactions with all of these other people.
I think I find that comforting, because Shakespeare the man is dead, and there's not that much we know directly about him, but we can access this brain through lots of recorded stuff that is surrounding him.
Yeah, but funnily enough, as I'm saying this, it's sort of occurring to me. So maybe this is a completely crazy thought, but it may also account for the revival of sort of authorship conspiracies around Shakespeare, particularly this is particularly the past 40 odd years, when scholarship has sort of moved Shakespeare into the world of, as I say, sort of participatory kind of writing. And at the same time, and in the same timeline, there's been a strain of fantasy that says we need this writer to be a sole genius. We need this writer to be a sole genius. It'd be even better if he's an aristocrat and someone connected closer to the Queen. That'd be lovely. But we kind of need him to be the single lightning rod who is able to draw on great university classical learning, or this aristocratic library, or these travels in France or Italy or wherever, to write all these plays. I think there's a sort of countervailing desire to sort of see Shakespeare as a solitary genius, which I suspect may have been fed by the parallel move to get him out of the garret and into the theatre.
Right. So actually the authorship question that I'm more interested by as an actor is the authorship that Burbage has over some of the plays, and authorship with plays is a very complicated thing, which we like to tidy it up and have it neat, but it's
really not. And that's I'm sorry, this is not going to be a talk about props, but just because they're here, and that's what this tome, so the New Oxford Shakespeare,
right,
which came out, it's not a very good edition, I have to say. I'm sorry if you like it, but came out 2016, I think, is really selling itself on. So it's really selling itself on Shakespeare, the collaborative writer. And it's used all sorts of a computer-based stylometric analysis to show that, oh, well, actually, Shakespeare never used the word wither, and Thomas Kyd used it 75 times. Therefore, this scene has to be by Thomas Kyd, not by Shakespeare. So it's done lots of kind of, linguistic analysis to sort of divvy up the plays into these little kind of bits that say, oh, so-and-so did this and so-and-so did that, which is precisely what you're describing, that sense that plays have many, many parents, because there are going to be people and influences operating on them all the time. But I also think it's kind of a fool's errand to try and kind of pin little sections down and say, oh, that's the bit that so-and-so did, and that's the bit that so-and-so wrote, because that's not the way things work organically. And I don't think it's essentialist and kind of ahistorical to say, well, we don't write plays that way now, so I'm sure they weren't written that way in 1600. I just sort of think it's just unrealistic to assume that you're kind of page by page and then never getting any kind of bleed. Yeah. So I think there is a real sense that it's incredibly freeing to acknowledge that sense of participatory work, but let's not go too far the other way and start trying to kind of divide up the corpus and kind of work out what bits he's really responsible for and what bits he's not, because I think that way madness lies.
Yeah. There's a George Bernard Shaw essay, and his writing on Shakespeare is very entertaining because he hates Shakespeare.
Yeah, he absolutely loathes it.
And sees him as his only kind of like only rival. That's his ego. But he wrote an interesting essay just about Shakespeare's company and how they don't get credit. And could you take us a bit into Shakespeare delivering his play, or did he deliver his play? They've got Hamlet. What's that process from?
So, I wish I could do that. I just did a class actually with my MA. We've got an MA program at the Globe, which is such joy. And we had a class last week on rehearsing Shakespeare. And that class was basically like, we don't really know. We don't know how he did it. We don't really know the answer to that question. But our general sense is that there's a scholar called Tiffany Stern who's written extensively on rehearsing Shakespeare. She has fairly kind of, a bit like George Bernard Shaw, she has fairly kind of clear views. It's not always entirely clear how much she likes Shakespeare. But anyway, she's kind of going for it. And she's very, very good and has plotted out kind of a likely timetable or a sort of schedule for what a new play delivery might have looked like. And her theory is that you get there's a period of time between delivery of a play and first night, but day, because they performed at 2 p.m, of anywhere between 3 days and 5 weeks, which is not massively helpful when trying to kind of like turn that into a standard how did they do it narrative. But it seems that there really was that quite sort of wide range of potential time it took to get a new play up on its feet, because sometimes plays were written with a view to comment on local incident, or because there's a request for something new from a patron, or for whatever reason. And sometimes new plays are written because they need new plays, and they can take the time to kind of work the preparation through a normal kind of a normal run of other activities. But what we imagine is that a playwright takes effectively a pitch to the owners of the company, and it doesn't work quite the same way with Shakespeare because he's a house playwright and a shareholder in his own company. But I don't think he'd go from 0 to 60 and just like hand over Hamlet. I think there's an initial stage where he says, which we referred to as the first reading, where it's not reading the whole play, and it probably isn't just him reading, but it's probably him laying out to his fellow shareholders in the Lord Chamberlain's Men and the King's Men the outline of the play, the parts in it, I imagine, for the chief actors, who would not have been typecast, but would have probably followed a kind of loose line in terms of the kind of the kind of roles they played. So, for example, in Hamlet, there's this in-joke, isn't there, about Julius Caesar, where Polonius witters on about the fact that he played Caesar as a student in wherever, and that's probably it's been suggested that the actor playing Polonius also played Caesar, and Burbage's Hamlet would have played Brutus, and there's all sorts of sort of. But if that actor's line was playing Polonius and Caesar, it's not that those roles are always identical. Caesar is not the same as Polonius in terms of a character type. So to say that the Polonius actor always played fastidious, annoying councillors, it isn't quite right. But there's a sort of middle-aged statesman line you can see that actor filling. So that first reading, Shakespeare sits down and says, right, it's a rewrite of that other play called Hamlet, which you might have seen 5 years ago. That's the first thing he'd say. And here's what I'm doing with it. Here's where we're going with it. There might be feedback. There might be comments. Maybe people would say things. Shakespeare goes away, does another number on it, comes back with a more or less finished play. There's another reading. There's more discussion. I imagine there's more feed-in from the company. We don't know then what's the process of sign-off. We don't know at what point they go, that's done, that's ready. Because actually that point then does require a certain degree of definitiveness about the play. Because once the play is signed off, the book itself is sent away to a hand copyist, and that hand copyist writes out individual parts. So however many, I don't know, 20 or so speaking parts, there are substantial speaking parts there are in Hamlet, each gets its own part. And the part is literally that. It is a scroll of paper with the part written on it. And all of that part's lines with a cue. 2 words, 3 if you're absolutely drenched in luck, probably just 2, giving you your part. And that's it. And then that's what's handed out to the company, and the company are told to go away and study that part. And by study, that means learn it. They'd have a bit of time, probably. That's why there's that gap, it could be 3 days, could be 5 weeks, to get the part down. In that process, there is some murkiness about what goes on within each actor's part. Because once an actor owns that part, literally owns it, has it in their chest of parts, and takes it out and kind of studies it and learns it, they've got a sort of degree of liberty within their speeches, because as long as the cues stay the same, no one else other than the writer will ever know that you've strayed. So although there's all sorts of scope for kind of authorized involvement and participation from the theatre company in those early stages, there's also a huge amount of scope for unauthorized adaptation and alteration. And I say unauthorized loosely, maybe it may just be an entirely accepted convention of the culture, but adaptation and alteration that arises from actors learning their part and either through error or through conscious choice, reworking the meat of their part, the middle bit of their part. Because as long as they're picking up a cue and giving a cue, the play will carry on. It's only when they start mucking around with cues that you'll get into difficulty, because then other actors won't get the cue they need to deliver their next speech. So once a play has been divided up into those parts and dispersed to the company, there's a certain rigidity to it, because unless all those parts are called back and rewritten and then relearnt, you can't mess around with the cues too much. But there's also a huge degree of license within those cues. So where the play then goes with that mix of flexibility and rigidity is kind of anyone's guess. And that might account for that variety you find in Shakespeare's printed texts between those printed as sort of standalone editions, those quartos, and then reprinted later in the first folio, where sometimes you get really kind of major distinctions between texts, and some of that will have arisen through evolution and change. from actor actor editing, I guess you'd call it. So yeah, there's so many kind of like points at which other voices and other pens and other brains come to bear on the text that it starts to be quite difficult to actually think about it as a text.
Yeah.
As soon as you've broken it up into those different parts, and there's one copy, handwritten copy that's owned by the bookkeeper, that's going to have scribblings over it and pieces of paper pinned in, and the early modern equivalent of Tipex kind of scrawled all over, and all of that sort of stuff. You go, well, that's a bit of a mess. The parts are all kind of dispersed to the four corners of the city. It only really exists on the days when they perform Hamlet and they come walk onto stage and say the lines in order, and then it happens. And then it goes away again when they go back into the tiring house and get ready for Richard II tomorrow. So there's a sort of, it's both exciting and also kind of terrifying how vulnerable it suddenly seems, and how much of a miracle it is that actually so many plays from the time survive, because they made it to the printing house, they got solidified into a version, if not the only version, but a version that can then be read 400 years later.
I'm just thinking about how much during a run, kind of your brain does weird things when you've learnt lines, and for whatever reason, you just swap out words and all these sorts of things, and things creep in and you forget bits, and kind of there must be huge reams of Shakespeare that the actors have just forgotten or reworded entirely.
And that's it, isn't it? And I suppose this really isn't, again, this is not about toppling Shakespeare. This is not Shakespeare is not a kind of statue of Colston in Bristol. This is not about knocking someone off a pedestal. Yeah. But I think the more you think about it, and the more you learn about the way plays were written and produced and manhandled, and I say that in the nicest possible way, but not treated with sort of kid gloves. The notion that something is kind of pure Shakespeare, or like that's what he meant, that's what he wrote, begins to look a little bit suspect, because you're like, well, there's probably reams of Shakespeare that he wrote that just got ditched, and then quite a lot of stuff that got incorporated into Shakespeare's canon that he didn't write, but would have been great, thrilled that it was there because it's great. And then quite a lot of stuff that came in that he's probably there kind of going, I cannot believe they're still saying that terrible line. And so it's so sort of, it really is, what's the word? It fluctuates, kind of what his work is. It's fluctuated historically through the centuries, even within one century. The number of plays that Shakespeare's folio acquired in the course of first, second, third, and fourth folio is astonishing. He's basically by the fourth folio, he's responsible for writing most of the early modern dramatic canon. Just because plays kind of get sort of dragged to his name, and he obviously sheds most of those later. But it's not an absolutely kind of finished question what the canon is. It is still flexible.
Yeah, I find that really exciting, that seeing it as, rather than a lone genius's achievement, a kind of a human achievement that we can all sort of own, and actually the culture has a lot to kind of take ownership of.
Well, I think it also gives huge license in a really important way to what you do with Shakespeare now, in the sense that this is it, that it's not there's nothing original there, but it's like it slightly liberates you from kind of thinking we need to do this precisely as Shakespeare did it. We need to do it, in exactly that kind of way. These texts are reinterpretable, and they're supposed to be reinterpretable. That's sort of their point. We know they went through versions in their own life, and those texts changed depending on whether Shakespeare's company were performing at the Globe or performing at their indoor playhouse at the Blackfriars. They probably changed when they were taken on tour. They probably changed over the 2 or 3 decades that they were in rep. That's just what happens to living dramatic works.
Mm. What was his brain like in terms of, because he's got an actor's brain and they're capable of doing those things which you've just described, of knowing these parts and multiple plays at once, learning them, and just then being able to do a whole play knowing 2 lines, 2 words of a cue. Is an extraordinary achievement.
It's amazing. I think about this a lot. I can't decide on what side I fall as to whether I fall on the it's explained by the context of early modern English educations and brains, or that actors were just absolute geniuses. And it's possibly it's both. But I think it does make a difference. Sorry if you can hear my dog. He's making a fuss. It does make a difference to imagine a world in which people are taught by rote. Are taught by rote. So you're at grammar school onwards. You recite.
It's fine.
I'm so sorry. You recite your kind of Latin declensions. You sort of recite Cicero's epistles. You're just learning so much by heart. I think it makes a difference that you live in a world where every week you go to church and you hear a substantial sermon, probably that lasts 45 minutes. And not everyone by any means, but lots of people are so interested in that sermon that they go home and they more or less write it down word for word. And they might have been taking sort of shorthand notes in church when Hamlet, having had his sort of like haunting from the ghost of his father, says, "My tables, it's me, I write down what he's just said." That's sort of what people would do in churches. They'd have their table books, which are usually little notebooks with waxed paper that you could make jottings on and then erase and use again. Right. So you make your jottings, then you go home and you write them up. So not non-actors, just sort of ordinary literate people would go to hear a sermon, go, "Oh my God, that's amazing. Let me just write down 4,000 words more or less from memory." So brains do work when trained in certain ways, work in different ways. And I think that's the world that these guys lived in. Mm-hmm. So when it came to learning 24 substantial parts, it certainly wasn't easy, and it required enormous skill, enormous hard work, enormous dedication. But that work took place in the context of a world in which learning things by rote was not as alien as we might think of it today. So I think that like super annoying question that I know actors get a lot in audience Q&A is the whole like, how do you learn all those lines? I don't think that question would necessarily occur to an early modern audience member in quite the same way. I think they might be impressed by it. They might recognize the skill in it, but I don't think it would strike them as a sort of foreign concept in the way that it does people who are less familiar with line learning today.
I always wonder because I'm obsessed with Hamilton and Lin-Manuel Miranda, and he's someone who's got a brain that is able to invent text instantly. His freestyling, but he also surrounds himself with the people who can do that as well. And they do these kind of improvised hip hop, which if you then wrote it down and studied the text, you go, "Oh, that's rhyming with that. That's syncopated with that. That's this amazing skill that happens instantly." And I wonder if your brain is capable of doing that, how that then informs how you approach text and the sort of the modern text work we do. That their brains are already there. They can think and improvise in iambic pentameter.
Yeah. I think that's true, and I think there's probably a sort of Malcolm Gladwell aspect to that, isn't there? There's a kind of 10,000 hours thing. Someone like Lin-Manuel Miranda, he's been doing it for a long time and has produced and has improved and has built up to a point that his brain and the brains of his artistic colleagues are able to do that. And I think that's the world we should imagine Shakespeare and his contemporaries. A brain that those brains get quite a head start with the form of elementary and secondary education that they got as boys going to grammar schools. Some of them got a kind of further stage of that at universities, although not necessarily the best of them. And they were then gifted with a theatre company, most of whom had a fairly similar education. By definition, you have to be literate to be an actor, and more than literate, you have to sort of really know literature and language, and also know your numbers. That term that was used for verse. Know what verse is, know what scansion is, know what rhyme is, know how it's supposed to work. So when you see it in your part, you can intuit what the writer wants you to do, because you might or might not have a lot of time to chat to the writer about that part, more likely not. So you need to rely on what clues the text is giving you. And the writer and you are working in the same language. You know, it's not as it is today for lots of modern actors, where part of the joy of Shakespeare is this process of discovery, where you're like, oh, that's what he means, amazing. It's, you know, 400 years ago, it's much more, oh, you're doing that, got you. Yeah, it's that thing, got it. Yeah, can do it. And that's not to say that I think it was dashed off or flippant or not, but just that he's working in a code which is familiar to the craftspeople and artists who are working with him. And you know, brilliant Shakespeare actors today worked really, really hard to get to the point that those early performers had slightly more kind of naturally. But it's not really natural; it's cultural. They had it more culturally, and we don't have that culture unless we really work at it, which is the genius of a good modern Shakespearean actor, is they're able to get to that point. But you know, Jamie, you've got to that point. You'll see it in actors you work with, that you do enough Shakespeare that you're never going to get everything, but it doesn't hold fears in the same way, and you pick up it seems intuitively, iambic pentameter and the kind of shape of a verse line, but actually it's not intuitive. It's because you work damn hard to get it, and the practice you've had in productions has given you that skill.
And presumably, if these have culturally, they've learnt Seneca and Chaucer and those kind of poets by rote, this is a walk in the park.
This is you know, this is gritty realism. This is, you know, absolutely, this is not something that requires the first 10 days of rehearsal to be spent around a table working out what he means. You know, it's vernacular, and it's heightened. You know, people didn't speak in iambic pentameter in a pub, but it's not that heightened.
Yeah, I'm so jealous of those actors. In some of the other sessions, I know Blanche talked about this, and Owen Horsley, the directors, they were talking about part of their job is to make sure the stakes are there in a play, and you have such an understanding of this world and where Shakespeare was coming from, particularly your work on sort of male friendships and that sort of thing, and all those things raise the stakes. Are there any things that you see in Shakespeare where, if only we knew what that promise meant, or what that interaction meant, or what this threat meant, that we just can't access culturally? Are there anything that comes to mind of?
That's a really, really good question. That's a very good question that's got me thinking about various things. I'm not sure if it's fully an answer to your question, but I do think that the stakes in the comedies are things that we possibly underestimate as audience members and as sometimes perhaps performers, but I often not, because I've seen some wonderful productions of Shakespeare's comedies. But I think we have we have largely, I would say, thanks to Shakespeare and to the First Folio, a fairly kind of clear sense of what a comedy is, what a tragedy is, what a history is, and what those various forms mean. So I'm not actually sure it is that clear for Shakespeare, but I certainly get the sense that, for example, Shakespeare's sort of marriage comedies, the stakes of something going wrong, or the stakes of, for example, a woman marrying the wrong husband, or a woman not marrying and not being able to secure financial security in the future, or the stakes of women being unfairly accused of adultery or infidelity or fornicate, are so huge for that individual as to sort of render the notion that the scene is a comic one kind of a bit absurd and even obscene, given what sort of might, and of course it is, like when Hero in Much Ado is accused of fornication the night before her wedding. There is no sense in which that scene is anything other than a than a disaster, completely clearly, and it prompts Beatrice's astonishing request of Benedict that he kill his best friend. So those stakes are high, evidently high, and we all acknowledge that they're high. But I think that's what we need to imagine being behind casual usages of terms like whore and cuckold and those sorts of things that kind of float around Shakespeare's plays like confetti. Now, they're everywhere, but they're not casually deployed words. It's not casually deployed language. And so when, for example, you get kind of students who are sort of desperate to find the kind of swear words in Shakespeare and get very excited about the bloody man is dead in Macbeth, you're going to go, it's fine. Funnily enough, one of the reasons that you don't have the kind of Anglo-Saxon four-letter words in Shakespeare's plays is that they're just not that serious. That there are plenty of other early modern writers, and do you mind if I swear? Is that going to cause?
I think that's fine.
But there are plenty of other early modern writers who sort of use fuck and shit and kind of, they're not that important. The words that get people that send kind of jolts through an audience or a reader are words to do with religion or sexual propriety, and those Shakespeare uses with abandon. So where he can, because Shakespeare is actually also quite careful not to contravene law, but where he can, Shakespeare puts in casual blasphemy and puts in references to female and male unchastity all over the place, making him and lots of other playwrights like him much more like a sort of foul-mouthed Tarantino than you might think from looking at the text, where you don't see evidence of those kind of more overt Anglo-Saxon swear words. But the intensity, the stakes with which those words are invested is massive, and something that we don't pick up on in the same way now. We just can't. Our world has moved on. So that's quite a roundabout and kind of evasive answer to your question in many ways. But I think it's that sense in which that the investment with certain principles or ideas around sexuality and religious identity are so potent in the late 16th century, early 17th century, that they're providing a powerful amount of motor in those plays that we don't always necessarily clock today.
And this is the stuff that actors love, because stakes are that's your scene for free.
Yeah.
So I know exactly what my target is. I know how to play this now. Yeah. So it seemed like it get me to a nunnery. If that's so, am I right in thinking nunnery is euphemistically a brothel?
Yeah, and it's often glossed that way. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that whole scene is hugely charged. If there's this relationship there, and he's saying, go to a whorehouse.
Funnily enough, I think it works both ways. Because both religion and sex are equally toxic or equally dangerous, sort of equally like explosive, let's say. In a sense, Hamlet is taking place in a world that is not overtly Protestant Denmark. It really isn't, but it is taking place on a stage in a Protestant country in a world that is already thinking about the tactical political significance of Denmark, because everyone knows that King James of Scotland is soon to be King of England, and everyone knows that King James's wife is Danish. Right. So there's a sort of sense in which Denmark does kind of figure in people's minds. So just to have, a kind of a Catholic idea of a nunnery kind of swirling around in itself is a frisson. Yeah. Even if it doesn't mean a brothel in that context, which I think it probably does, but it's doing double duty.
Wow. Are there any moments where you're kind of frustrated, thinking, "Oh, that should be the most electrifying thing anyone ever sees on stage, but we just can't access it"?
Not exactly. Although I will say, I think my favourite speech in Shakespeare is Emilia's speech in Act 4 of Othello. In the Willow Song scene, when she gives her sort of takedown of the sexual double standard, after Desdemona asks her if she thinks there are women who behave like like men behave to women? And Emilia says, yeah, probably some of them, and gives this wonderful speech where, you know, it's the sort of feminist equivalent of "Hath not a Jew eyes,"
Right.
And it's so scorching. And I've seen it done brilliantly, you know. Because it's a wonderful speech, and actors adore it. You know, it's a gift of a speech. But what I sort of love about it is that it lands in the most exquisite way today, because it's this clarion call for a kind of feminist sense of sexual equality. But I don't think that's how Shakespeare intended it.
Right.
I think he I'm still undecided about what he thinks of Emilia. And I think he intended it to represent a dangerous form of sexual relativism that just implies that Emilia is not to be trusted. I think from the way that from her kind of journey in the play, and the fact, you know, I think it's one of those sort of astonishing Shakespeare moments where he's doing something on his own terms, in his own world, which has kind of evolved and sort of marinated and kind of stewed over the centuries to become a cry representing something else, which fits our world much better, and which in a way has fed our world. You know, the sense that sort of, you know, Emilia is a sort of as a kind of representative figure of kind of voiceless female anger. We've been recognised for 200 years, you know. So it's not that it's again a participatory way in which Shakespeare's work is helping to sort of shape the world. But I love that speech because of the way it lands in a modern performance, in a way that is, I think, evolved from where it was potentially intended to be by Shakespeare. You know, always hard to talk about intention. Yeah.
That's kind of fascinating, seeing these kind of cultural touch points of, we can make a comparison there. That's a doorway.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask some audience questions now. So Susie West's asking, the audience he's writing for, would Shakespeare be testing and adapting plays in a different way than today's writers?
Hi, Susie. It's really, he's such a reuser as Shakespeare. You know, he reworks pre-existing London plays. So Hamlet, Henry V, Taming of the Shrew. You know, those are plays that existed. Taming of the Shrew is an interesting, slightly thorny question, but almost certainly existed in another version, written by someone else in another playhouse. So I think Shakespeare is incredibly canny at recognizing literary dramatic properties that deserve reworking, and giving them the rocket boost they need to make them really good for his audience. You know, so I think he's very, very good at reworking what's there already. Whether he does a sort of tryout and does a version of a play, puts it out in front of an audience, does another number on it, and brings it back out again, don't know. And my hunch is that he doesn't, or only does so in exceptional circumstances, because the labor that's required to get a play drafted, copied out into parts, learnt by a company, rehearsed in the minimal way it would be rehearsed, and then in front of an audience, only for then substantial edits and changes to be made, makes me question whether they'd have had the resources to do that. So my feeling is more that if a play was super unsuccessful and no one liked it, they just quietly shelved it. And maybe, you know, the writer, Shakespeare or whoever, comes back to that topic and that theme and reworks it in a different way. And that's, I'm sure, the case for plays that were successful as well. You kind of, you know, you do the sort of broadly the same thing again. So I don't know is the answer, but I suspect that process of revision and tweaking, when it happened, and I suspect it did in a casual way, happened within the frame of an actor's part. So I think you'll be more likely to find Burbage being told to cut 10 lines out of that speech, compressing it down while keeping the kind of outline of the speech the same, which obviously you could do quite a lot in terms of adapting and changing, but it's not quite a wholesale rewrite.
Brilliant. Another question from this from Helen Street. At the Globe Theatre in Shakespeare's time, when would performances start and end? And was this timing affected by the change of the seasons, with the light falling earlier or later?
So plays started at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, as far as we know, and they lasted between 2 and 3 hours. That's really our best. It's not really a guess. It's sort of what we know. 2 hours traffic on the stage, well-known line from the prologue to Romeo and Juliet. 2 hours is kind of that's kind of used. That's a conventional term that's used in lots of early modern plays. It doesn't mean that it's 120 minutes bang on, but it means that it's within a 2 hour span of time that's indicated mostly by church bells. So if you imagine a play taking space within 5 dongs, how many? 2 dongs and then 3 dongs. Anyway, 2 sets of dongs. That could conceivably span up to almost 3 hours. You know, you're kind of that would still sort of sit within the imaginative frame of a 2 hour play because you've had two dongs on the church bells. You run up against afternoon divine service when you get around 5 o'clock or thereabouts. So it's quite important that it's over by 5. That's obviously also a fairly major issue in terms of time and nightfall. So you don't want a play going into well past 4:30 in winter time. So we assume about 2.5, 3 hours. We assume 2 o'clock start. We think it's quite likely that often plays finish in quite gloomy light. That you get a sense that, that it's, your eyes will adjust to the gloom. But when these people weren't watching Shakespeare's work on a dazzling stage, especially in the winter or the autumn or spring. I mean, most of the year they're not watching it on a dazzling stage, and it's very unlikely there'd be any form of artificial light in an amphitheatre, an outside amphitheatre. It wouldn't work. You just get flaming torches blinding people, and they wouldn't see what else was on the stage. So yeah, I think we can imagine closing scenes in the gloom, which
does fit with a lot of the Act 5.
Lots of the plays, exactly. Yeah.
What was the atmosphere like of that audience? Because lots of people like to think of it as you being rotten veggies being chucked at you and stuff. And
I don't want to sound too like a sort of terrible kind of corporatist, sort of business obsessed person, but people paid good money to go to the theatre. I don't think they went to throw. I mean, there were stocks. They could throw vegetables at people in the stocks if they were that keen to throw vegetables. It's sort of, they went to the theatre to consume with great avidity the plays that were on offer there. And I think audiences had a very kind of healthy both respect and disrespect for the work, in the same way that we have, we can be scathing about popular culture today but still consume it. And I think that sense of engagement, I'm sure, came out in lots of ways, but I don't think they were willfully disruptive. And I think audiences would have self-policed. I think audience members who wanted to make a fool of themselves or other people would have been hushed, would have been ejected, would have been jostled out by other audience members, I imagine.
I think I read a source somewhere of they had bottles with a cork in.
Yeah.
And someone got shushed because they unplugged a cork and it made a pop.
Well, there's a 1630s playwright called Jasper Mayne, who writes a little kind of epigram that says there's an author who kind of gets who's kind of inconsolable because he thinks this the hiss of a bottled ale cap being opened is an audience member hissing, and hissing is like booing. So if you hiss at something, you don't like it. So they kind of get to the hiss, and it's like, oh my god, they hate my play. I can't which I can totally imagine a writer doing.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, such tension and kind of anxiety. Oh no, it's a question for me. I'll email them later. What's your favorite? you obviously delight in those kind of stories and those little tidbits. What's your kind of favorite thing which kind of really encapsulates that's what this early modern world is? This is the secret that you don't know about this world. This is the best kind of portal into it.
Jamie Wilkes, that's a beast of a question. How could you?
We're coming up to the end, so I think we'll end on a
that's just one. Awful. Gosh. Again, this is probably a slightly sort of evasive answer, and it's not fully doing justice to your question, but it's lots of people will know that Twelfth Night, Shakespeare's wonderful comedy Twelfth Night, was performed early on in its life at Middle Temple Hall in London at a sort of command performance for the lawyers and law students of that inn. And we know that because of a record in the diary, I guess, the sort of journal of a law student called John Manningham, who was a young resident at Middle Temple Hall. And his little account of Twelfth Night is wonderful, partly because first-hand accounts of Shakespeare's plays are quite rare. There's a handful of them from his lifetime. So someone watching sort of a very early performance of Twelfth Night is very precious, and he's quite a kind of perspicacious viewer. Like, he kind of gets that it's like Comedy of Errors, in fact, is sort of building on Roman Plautus comedies. He mentions one called the Menechmi. He gets that it's also riffing on an old Italian story called Gli Ingannati, I think it means the deceived, or the deceived ones, which was doing the rounds in various forms of translation in England. So actually quite obscure stuff. Plautus isn't obscure, but that random Italian play is very obscure. So he kind of notes all this down. So it's all quite learned. And then just says how much he loves the fact that Malvolio gets tricked and made to think that his mistress is in love with him. So I just kind of love that kind of combination of kind of quite sort of bringing us back to your opening question, your opening provocation, but that sort of combination of the kind of bookish and the source study and the tracing of Shakespeare's influences, and just the joy in the performance and the joy in staged comedy. And again, we don't know who would have played Malvolio. It's not the clown role. It's probably not the star role. But any actor will tell you that doing Twelfth Night now, that Malvolio is kind of the role that wants. So it's kind of so it's clearly one that also made a massive impact on that early law student witness in 1602. Christmas, whatever, February time, 1602. And I just love that. I love that glimpse into someone watching a Shakespeare play. It'd be even better if it was at the Globe, but I don't really care if it's at Middle Temple Hall.
So Shakespeare's writing for people who have extraordinary knowledge, so he can nod and reference to, in the same way that kind of Tarantino does, where he does very niche references to films that no one's ever seen, but if you know them, they're so delicious.
I was listening to the radio a few weeks ago that was marking The Simpsons becoming the longest scripted comedy in television history, and whoever was talking about The Simpsons, I think it was a member of the writing team, was pointing out that one of its great strengths and its sort of genius elements is the fact that it writes at those levels, that it has incredibly, The Simpsons can have incredibly sophisticated, witty humor, adult humor, not in a kind of salacious way, but just incredibly sophisticated humor that requires a breadth of cultural reference and knowledge that no child will ever have, but that is also a cartoon that provides huge entertainment to kids and to young people, and it's able to do those two things seamlessly. And I think that's, Shakespeare does that better than anyone. He did it better than anyone when he was writing. That sort of that ability to bridge without resenting either headland. Being able to bridge those two kind of extremes of the Plautine, random, obscure Italian literature with Benny Hill worthy kind of sex comedy is astonishing. And that's perhaps not expressed in those terms, but that's what early audiences are picking up on.
Well, Benny Hill level comedy, I think, is the perfect place.
Benny Hill and Plautus. Plautus kind of is Benny Hill for the Romans.
Yeah, I think that's fair. That's very fair. But, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
That's been such a. I hope everyone at home can see why actors absolutely adore kind of these lectures and this kind of this relationship with the scary academic world, which isn't scary at all. It's actually really useful because it unlocks things and makes our jobs so much easier than just trying to kind of learn roles and hope for the best. But if you can all give your kind of at home digital claps and clap your screens or do whatever you want to do.
Not too hard.
No, don't actually hit your screen. Yeah. But thank you so much, Will. It's been absolutely brilliant to talk to you.
Jamie, it's been a huge pleasure. And hello, everyone associated with the Willow Globe. I was saying to Jamie, I should have in fact been at the Willow Globe in the summer, the benighted summer of 2020. And I'm very sorry to have missed that chance, but I will hopefully visit soon.
2021.
That's the year for everything.
The new renaissance.
Yeah, it really is. It really is.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been absolutely brilliant. This has been such an amazing kind of four sessions which link in surprising ways, and I've learned so much. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have enjoyed it, you can donate to Shakespeare Link at shakespearelink.org.uk/donate. Please do. These sessions are free, but every little helps in these testing times. Hopefully we'll be back in 2021 with some more sessions and more exciting people. I'll probably invite you back, Will, because it's been
happy to.
There's a lot more to discuss, but thank you so much. And once again, everyone, if you can just give your digital rounds of applause for Dr. Will Tosh.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care, Jamie.
Go off live now, ending stream. Goodbye. End stream.